Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. It is for December 2025 years after Jesus. We're starting a new series today on the Republican Professor on Israel. We're starting at the beginning, the history of Israel. And to help us with that material, we have someone that I was not able to invite on the podcast as a guest because he died before I was able to do that. In fact, he died quite a long time ago. But this individual was my intellectual grandfather and a spiritual grandfather of mine. And I know that you are probably noticing that there is a theme on this podcast of honoring our elders who have contributed to our well-being and growth by mentioning them and passing on what they have taught us. Now, when I say grandfather, I mean that because I didn't study with him myself. One of my professors studied with him and then passed it on. That's so it's two removed, but it's a very important relationship. And I highly recommend you check out the episode that I did over the summer on Do You Have a Mentor? You'll notice that I mention my mentors a lot. Well, one of my mentors was a man named Dr. Bruce Demarest. Spiritual Formation and Theology, one of the co-authors with my mentor in high school, Dr. Gordon R. Lewis of Integrative Theology, 3 volumes. And I really should show you that. So I'm going to go ahead and go get that book right now. I'm going to pause this. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back and I have Dr. Demarest's book. And so I'm going to show you this book here. What I want you to notice is the care that I take into passing on from the past to the future. Integrative Theology, 3 volumes. This guy right here, Dr. Gordon R. Lewis, was my high school mentor. He later became my professor of history of philosophy and logic at Denver Seminary. He also taught me a course on apologetic method. And Dr. Bruce Demarest is the other man I was mentioning. Dr. Bruce Demarest studied under F. Bruce at the University of Manchester in England. Now, I'm passing this on to you because it's very valuable material. I was exposed to this when I was in high school, and it was incredibly valuable. Later, I ended up studying at Denver Seminary, and I have some ephemera from the time period. You can't find these anymore, these pamphlets, but this was the pamphlet of the program I was admitted to, Philosophy of Religion at Denver Seminary. And what I love about it is it's got the faculty at the time. There's Dr. Doug Grotice, two-time guest on the Republican Professor podcast. There's Dr. Gordon R. Lewis, who has passed on in 2016. There is a guest on this podcast through his writings, though he has passed on, Dr. Vernon Grounds. And there's the courses that you could take. That's for philosophy of religion. And I ended up getting a degree after 4.5 years of study in biblical studies, Master of Arts in Biblical Studies. We have more fun for the whole family here. We've got Dr. Craig Blomberg, and a guest on the Republican Professor podcast. and wonderful classes that you can take. Great academic experience there. My first master's out of four was in biblical studies. And as you can see, this is a department to acquaint you with the biblical languages and literature, as well as the history and culture and theology of the Bible. Um, the point of this program was to help people, seeks to prepare graduates to perform well in PhD studies. And it definitely did that for me. So I also wanted to show you that I have the original receipt. And I like doing this. I like keeping the receipt because it helps me remember I'm not crazy. Here's a photograph of me. That's Robbie Blanks, a guest on this podcast in 2022. He was a missionary in Africa. And there's Dr. Gordon R. Lewis. And this is the parking lot of Denny's in Lakewood, Colorado, probably just a few miles from where Dr. Gordon R. Lewis lived at the time. But I was going to show you a receipt. I'm glad I have this photo in here because Robbie and I had Dr. Gordon R. Lewis as our mentor when we were in high school. Robbie was the one that introduced me to Gordon Lewis. Here's the receipt. Why am I showing you this receipt? This is from Showers of Blessing Christian Bookstore, 808-623 Life, Life. Well, you have my address there from when I lived in Wahiwa, Hawaii. This is in Mililani Town Center. It doesn't have the exact address of the bookstore. That's kind of a bummer. But it does have his name, the guy that wrote it, Claude, the guy that wrote this up. It's a special order request. And I put a deposit of $52.07 down. $52.07. This was in 1996, the 2nd of July, 1996. I had just come back from my first deployment. I went to the Mililani Town Center. I think it was the town center. Anyway, found Showers of Blessing. I special ordered this book. It had just come up hot off the press. 3 volumes in one, Integrative Theology by Gordon R. Lewis and Bruce Demarest. And I think that photo that I showed you of me, Robbie, and Dr. Lewis was from 1996. I think it's right. In fact, it might have been a time I had with him at the Denny's parking lot in Colorado when I was on leave. You can see my backpack, and I have that my strap on that. That indicates to me I had just gotten back from deployment. Um, I spent $52 in 1996 on this book. And I went to a local bookstore. This is before Amazon. I didn't have a computer. I didn't have the internet. I didn't have an email address. They ordered it through the mail, and I picked it up at the store, a physical brick and mortar store. And I've had it ever since, and I've gotten a lot of good use out of it. And I had to use it in seminary later. Now, what does all this have to do with our topic today, the history of Israel? Well, I think you're going to find out because F. Bruce was a scholar I became acquainted with shortly after that. Just a couple of years later, I went to school in Hawaii for my undergrad. You have to get your undergrad before you go to graduate school and seminary. Seminary is graduate training, it's graduate work, it's master's level work. At the time of that photograph, I did not have a master's degree. I had a bunch of college credits, but I didn't have a bachelor's degree. I went to Wayland Baptist University in Aiea, Hawaii, and they require biblical studies training. And I was exposed to this guy right here, F. Bruce. Now, when I went to Denver Seminary, I later found out Bruce Demarest studied under F. Bruce at the University of Manchester. And F. Bruce had the Rylands, he was the Rylands Professor of Biblical Criticism and Exegesis at the University of Manchester. England was quite a place to go get biblical studies training for many Christians because the British system had built into it, because of the Church of England, graduate training, some of the finest, exquisite graduate training in theology and biblical studies in the world because of Oxford, Cambridge, Aberdeen, and St Andrews, the four medieval universities, and then later universities like the University of Manchester, Birmingham, um, you know, the other universities that trickle down, Durham, um, Nottingham, you know, what was that one? Starts with an S. I forget. Um, yeah, what was that one? Crap. My other professor, Danny Carroll, went there. Let me see if it has his resume in here. Sheffield. Yeah, University of Sheffield. So universities like that. My professors were trained over there in England. So Craig Blomberg, for example, has his PhD from the University of Aberdeen, which is one of the four medieval universities. So did William Klein, who taught my exegesis of Romans and James courses. So F. Bruce is a major figure in the 1900s, and this stuff it doesn't get stale. I don't think. Okay. This was published in 1963. The modern nation state of Israel, or I should say maybe the contemporary nation state of Israel, goes back to 1948. Now, there's a gap between ancient Israel and the modern nation state of Israel, but I'm only pointing this out because this book, Israel and the Nations, was written in England and published in 1963. Its reception would not just have been interesting for biblical studies reasons, its inception would have been interesting because there was a 15-year-old modern contemporary nation state after World War II, also called Israel, and also claiming to be Jewish. That was the whole point of the modern nation state of Israel. It still is, as far as I can tell, the point, right? And so, politically speaking, nowadays, the connection is not only one of linguistics, and it's one of ethnicity, right? Where do the Jewish people come from? Where does this whole Israel thing come from? What is its significance at all, either now or back then? And to do that, we're going to make some progress here by getting to the introduction. Why should there be such deep and widespread interest at this time of day in the early history of Israel? That's how F. Bruce starts this book, Israel and the Nations. in his introductory chapter. That's how he starts the book. And incidentally, I'm going to show you behind me really quick. I'm going to expose behind me really quick. Okay. There's a painting right there. That painting was done by Dr. Lewis's wife, Willa. This Dr. Lewis. Willa, his wife, painted that and gave it to us for free. I just wanted to point that out. Anyway, okay, so why would we be interested in Israel? Why should school teachers in the English speaking world find that the things that happened to that small nation in the last millennium BC, that's before Christ, are relevant to their task of educating young people in the last half century of the second millennium AD, that is Anno Domini, that is after Christ, since Jesus, right? Anno Domini, the year of our Lord in Latin. Why Israel? Why not her kinfolk and neighbors, the Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, for example? The answer to this question can be found nowhere but in the distinctive features of Israel's religion. There was something about it that was unparalleled in the surrounding world. An Assyrian king might try to discourage any resistance on the part of the Israelites by pointing to the uselessness of the gods of greater and more powerful states which he had overthrown. Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? He asked. A most pertinent question which might well be repeated today. Where indeed are they? And how does it come about that the God of Israel continues to be worshipped by millions of people in every one of the earth's continents? The Israelites had their own explanation as they considered their experience of the God of their fathers. They affirmed, He has not dealt thus with any other nation. Their affirmation is vindicated by the course of their history. So says F. F. Bruce, the Rylands Professor of Biblical Criticism and Exegesis at the University of Manchester in Britain. Not so Great Britain, but England. It would be Mercia. It's the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, which is south of Northumbria, west of East Anglia, north of Sussex and Wessex. You guys know this, right? I'm sure you do, but I don't want to bore you. But this is a fair use and transformative reading of Israel and the Nations by F. F. Bruce, published by the Erdman's Publishing Company in 1963. We're in the introductory chapter. We're not going to read the preface. We're not going to read the list of maps. Yet Israel's national history was not lived out in isolation from other peoples. The Israelites were surrounded by nations greater and mightier than themselves, who impinged upon the life of Israel at innumerable points. It is in the varied response to the challenge presented by these other nations, Asian, African, and European, that Israel's own nationhood acquires its special character. Hence, the subject of this book is not Israel in isolation, but Israel and the nations. For much of the period covered in this work, Our most important primary sources are the books of the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament. In these books, the story of Israel is told as sacred history. That is to say, the narrator's interest was not so much in political developments as in the dealings of the God of Israel with his people. Yet they retain their religious value to this day, both for the Jewish people and for the Christian church. Yet, while these books have come down to us as Holy Scripture, they are historical source documents of first rate worth. The chapters which follow are not concerned with them as canonical writings, but as material for constructing a political narrative. Okay, I'm going to read that again. Pay close attention to what I'm saying. Bottom of page 11, top of page 12, F. Bruce, Israel and the Nations. Ryland's professor of exegesis and biblical literature at the University of Manchester. Okay. While these books have come down to us as Holy Scripture, they are historical source documents of first-rate worth. The chapters which follow are not concerned with them as canonical writings, but as material for constructing a political narrative. Other source material has been laid under contribution for which no canonical claims have been made, the writings of secular historians and the inscriptions of ancient cultures contemporary with the life of Israel in the period under review. These last named documents have come to light as a result of the archaeological research carried out in the Near East for well over a century and a half. Their discovery has enabled us to appreciate, in a way previously impossible, how remarkably faithful is the historical outline preserved in the Hebrew Bible from the age of the patriarchs to the Macedonian supremacy. But to our tale. Okay. Well, chapter 1 is Israel's beginnings, 1300 to 1100 BC. And this goes from page 13 to page 20. And these are short chapters, which is what I like about the book. The earliest reference to the Israelites in any record outside the Old Testament occurs in an inscription on a pillar set up about 1220 BC by Berneptah, king of Egypt, to celebrate several victories won in the course of his reign. Among other claims to have conquered neighboring peoples, he boasts, and this is a quote, Israel is desolate, it has no seed left, unquote. That's from the Merneptah Stele, which is a source, a historical source. It's basically it's writings preserved on artifact. That's not a book we would normally think of as a book. From the way in which Israel is written in this inscription, it appears that Israel was not yet a settled nation. The inscription will therefore have to be dated within a generation or two after the departure of the Israelites from Egypt. If Merneptah's claim had been well founded, there would be no story of Israel to tell. But ancient commanders, like their more recent successors, were prone at times to overestimate the scale of their victories. Israel was not so completely desolate, so utterly bereft of all hope of posterity as Merneptah claimed. And I'm not going to read the footnotes. The footnotes are very good. Um, like for example, footnote 2 has a quotation from the king Mesha of Moab. Israel utterly perished forever. There's interesting little tidbits, but I will leave it to you to look at the footnotes, unless just one just pops out at me. Okay. But yeah, they can be a little clunky, but I think overall I really like footnotes, and I would prefer that they're right at the bottom of the page so I don't have to look them up. I don't like endnotes. Page 14. Oh, sorry, page 13. We cannot be sure if the desolation of Israel to which King Merneptah refers corresponds to any occasion mentioned in the Israelites' own records. It is just conceivable that it is the only official Egyptian account of the circumstances attending their crossing of the Red Sea, although the context suggests that Israel had already entered Canaan. And he's saying you can also say Sea of Reeds, and he interacts with the Hebrew there. A name applied to the Gulfs of Suez and Aqaba. If you know where Aqaba is, get a get a map of Sinai and you'll find where Aqaba is. Aqaba comes in, shoot, the first time I heard about Aqaba was probably Lawrence of Arabia. Have you seen the film Lawrence of Arabia? It's an older film. Um, I think it's 1960s or something like that. It's about World War One. Um, I'm reading the book Lawrence of Arabia. I've had the book for 30 years. I've never finished it. My goal is to finish it. I've had it for 31 years, that book, Lawrence of Arabia. Big, thick book. And it's a nice way to get at World War One. World War One is one of those topics that I don't think you can learn enough about. Um, Let me just give you one example. There's a lot of talk, and we're going to cover it on the podcast at some point, about England's recent immigration fiascos as it pertains to Muslims. And I'm talking about in the last 8 to 9 years, 10 years. Okay. The the decisions that went into leading some people to vote for Brexit, for example. Well, if you read Lawrence of Arabia, which is a story about how British intelligence, maybe it's a contradiction in terms, but British intelligence during World War II, based in Cairo, some combination of accidentally and on purpose, made an alignment with Arabian Muslim tribes to fight and win World War One. And as you know, the major player in World War One in the European side was Germany, right? And Germany was fighting against England. Germany was allied with Turkey, the what was called the Ottoman Empire, and it was a vast and powerful and long-lasting empire for hundreds of years. You have to know a little bit about geography here. You might want to take a look at Turkey and take a look at the entire Middle East. And you have to realize that Saudi Arabia, as we know, Saudi Arabia did not exist back then. It was under Turkish control, the Ottomans, including Iraq, including the modern nation state of Israel. There were lots of tribes, just like in the United States, didn't exist 300 years ago. There was no United States. There was what we call America, and there were people that were already here when Europeans came, and we call them Indians. Sometimes they're the politically correct word or the woke word is Native Americans. I don't like that word because anyone born here is Native American. Sometimes they're called indigenous peoples. Sometimes they're called First Nations. Um, but depends on what you mean by indigenous, and it depends on what you mean by nation. But in any case, I use the term Indian because that's the historically correct term, and it's the term used in law. It's the legally correct term. It's the term that's used in our founding documents, for example. And so we use it even today. I mean, like I pointed out when Biden was president last year, I pointed out that the Department of Interior, it still has the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, the Indian Health Service, IHA, IHS. Well, just like the United States, the America that we have here had Indians all over the place. They were in tribes. Same in the Middle East. There were all these tribes of Arabs, and many of whom had come to accept Islam. Um, I bet that there was some syncretism with some local ancient religions, but there was definitely an Islamic culture, right? Well, Lawrence of Arabia takes that history, and British intelligence was because of their control of Egypt at the time was very concerned about Turkey, what we call the Ottoman Empire, and especially their alignment with Germany during World War II. So British intelligence had as a goal to split the Ottoman Empire against itself. And and this guy Lawrence, called Lawrence of Arabia, he was a British officer, a very quirky guy, intellectual, loved archaeology, was basically an archaeologist by training. He was an artist and archaeologist. He was also very handy with languages, and he was there years before World War One, learning Arabic and talking with people and learning about them. And that all came in very handy when there was a war going on, and he found out through intelligence sourcing that the Arabs were not happy with the Turks. They were not happy with the Ottoman Empire. There was a lot of corruption, and they basically wanted it to go away. But they were afraid. So with British backing, and it was a very delicate thing because they don't like the British either, right? So Britain made all these promises to all these Arabs and all these Muslims, is my point. I hope you're able to follow this. This goes back over 100 years. So there's these relationships that the British Empire had with vast numbers of millions of Muslims in their empire. So you have to understand that when you when you think of the influx of Muslims in England proper, there's a history of this, of Muslims in the British Empire, that that does not parallel the United States, just FYI. It's not the same idea at all. Okay, let's keep going here. Importance of history here. Page 14. Uh, did I finish 13? No, I didn't finish 13 yet. Okay. It is just conceivable that it is the only official Egyptian account of the circumstances attending their crossing of the Red Sea, although the context suggests rather that Israel had already entered Canaan. This is the Merneptah Stele we're talking about. At any rate, the departure of the people of Israel from Egypt marks their birth as a nation. Some generations previously Some generations previously, their ancestors, members of a pastoral clan, had gone down from Canaan to Egypt in the time of famine and settled in the Wadi Timulat. Timulat, sorry. The early kings of Dynasty 14, Seti I and Ramses II, that's 1300 to 1225 BC, drafted them and large numbers into forced labor gangs for the building of fortified cities on the northeastern frontier of Egypt. This is page 14 at the top. They rapidly lost their former manner of life and were in danger of forgetting the faith of their fathers. A few generations more, and they would have been assimilated into their depressed fellow serfs of Egyptian origin. Their ancestral faith, however, was rekindled by Moses, a man of their own race. This Moses had been brought up through a strange combination of events at the Egyptian court, but eventually had to flee for his life to northwest Arabia when he was caught espousing the cause of his enslaved kinsmen. In northwest Arabia, he became allied by marriage with a priestly family of the Kenite tribe, and in a vision, he received a command from God, whom Israel's ancestors had worshipped, to return to Egypt and lead his brethren out to the place where the vision appeared to him. The land of Canaan, he was told, had been divinely promised to these ancestors, and their God had not forgotten his promise, nor had he failed to observe the affliction of their children. He was about to redeem his promise, and in token of his purpose, he made himself known to Moses by the name Yahweh, a name by which the patriarchs had not worshipped him, but which expressed his character as a covenant keeping God. Moses therefore returned to Egypt and led his people out of that land into the wilderness of northwest Arabia amid a series of natural phenomena in which could be traced the directing power of the patriarch's God intervening for the deliverance of their descendants. And indeed, these phenomena were such as Moses in the ordinary way could neither have foreseen nor controlled. Yet their occurrence just at that time confirmed the directions given to him in his vision and rendered possible Israel's escape from Egypt in a way, in the way in which Moses assured them it would happen. Moses, in fact, was the first and greatest of the long succession of prophets whose influence upon the religious life of Israel was in the long run so decisive. Men who spoke in the name of Israel's God and interpreted the events of the past, present, and future in terms of his revealed character and will. But no prophet's influence was so determinative of the national life as was that of Moses. So much so that it had been well said that if he did not exist, he would have had to been invented to account for the rise and progress of the nation of Israel. The plagues which affected the Egyptians on the eve of Israel's departure from their land, the recession of the waters of the Yam Suf, a northerly extension of the Gulf of Suez, which took place in a moment of desperate need and enabled them to cross when they were hard pursued by the Egyptian chariotry and hemmed in by hills to the north and south, the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, which led them to their rendezvous with God, the awe-inspiring phenomena which they saw and heard as they approached the sacred mountain. All these were interpreted to them by Moses as revelations of the power of their God acting for them in deliverance and providence. Page 15 at the top. The band of Egyptian chariotry, which pursued the departing. Sorry about that. Did you hear that? The band of, okay, sorry, let me check my sound here. Yeah, I scratched my ear. The band of Egyptian chariotry, which pursued the departing Israelites to prevent their escape from Egypt, was caught and overwhelmed when the Yam Suf returned to its normal limits. And the Israelites, after exulting in this fresh display of Yahweh's care for them, trekked eastwards by way of the wilderness of the Yam Suf, across the head of the Gulf of Aqaba, until they reached the sacred mountain, variously called Horeb or Sinai. I mentioned the Gulf of Aqaba earlier because the battle at the Gulf of Aqaba in Lawrence of Arabia, the film, is a major turning point. And so the control of that territory in World War One was very important. As you know, the Suez Canal was very important, and the British had a concern to control that, didn't want it to be threatened by Germany. Um, those kind of concerns also came up in World War Two, but Lawrence of Arabia is restricted to World War One. Anyway, Gulf of Aqaba, so if you know anything about film or read the book Lawrence of Arabia, you'll know what I'm talking about, at least when you get to that part of the book. But in the film, it's a major development in the film. I highly recommend the film, by the way. Just check out the film. It's a good connection. Okay, let's see here. Um, okay, cross the head of the Gulf of Aqaba until they reach the sacred mountain, variously called Horeb or Sinai. Here, near the place where Moses had received his first commission from Yahweh, the people solemnly undertook to keep the covenant into which Yahweh had brought them with himself. He would be their God, as he had already shown himself to be, and they would be his people. The basis of the covenant was an early form of the Ten Commandments, or 10 words, in which Yahweh made known his will for his people. The preamble to the 10 words clearly identified the God who thus declared his will for them. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. The God who had done that for them, to whose power and mercy thus displayed they owed their existence as a people, might well be accepted as their God. There was none like him among the gods, majestic in holiness, terrible in glorious deeds, doing wonders. Well might they bow to his exclusive terms. You shall have no other gods before me. For what other God was worthy to be mentioned alongside Yahweh? Okay. In paying him worship, they were to make no attempt to represent his likeness by means of an image. They were to treat his name with the reverence which was his due. They were to reserve for him every seventh day, and in thought and word and deed they were to treat one another in a manner befitting the covenant which bound them all together. They were to regard themselves as a holy people, a people set apart for Yahweh. But Yahweh was a God who was not only incomparably powerful, but also incomparably righteous, merciful, and true to his pledged word. And therefore, men and women who were holy to him, reserved for him, must reproduce these qualities in their own life and conduct. So there's a summary of the Ten Commandments. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, the God who had done that for them, to whose power and mercy thus displayed they owed their existence as a people, might well be accepted as their God. There was none like him among the gods, majestic in holiness, terrible in glorious deeds, doing wonders. Well might they bow to his exclusive terms. You shall have no other gods before me. For what other God was worthy to be mentioned alongside Yahweh? This attitude we may call practical monotheism. Whether other gods, the vanquished gods of Egypt, or the gods of the Canaanites or of other nations, might have some sort of existence was which not a question about which either Moses or his followers were likely to trouble themselves. Their business was to worship Yahweh their God and serve him alone. Moses has ever been looked upon as the first and greatest lawgiver the is of the Israelites, page 16 at the top. In his own person, he combined the functions of prophet and priest and king. He judged their lawsuits and taught them the principles of their religious duty, not only in the details of the sacrificial worship, but in many aspects of ordinary life as well. No matter in how many parallel or successive recensions his laws might be preserved and from time to time repromulgated, no matter how they might be expanded and applied to changing conditions of life. In written form or in oral tradition, Israel's law would never cease to be known as the law of Moses. Rightly so, for the principles laid down in his time before the settlement in Canaan remained the principles of Israel's law for all centuries to come. Well, we are getting to the middle of page 16. The Mosaic legislation is divided on grounds of style and content into two readily distinguishable groups of laws. There are the case laws or the judgments cast in such a form as if a man do so and so, he shall pay so much. And there are the statutes expressed in categorical or apodictic form, thou shalt or thou shalt not do so and so, or whosoever does so and so shall surely die. When these Old Testament laws are compared with other ancient Near Eastern law codes, it is to the former group, the case laws, that the parallels are found. This is the form, for example, in which the laws of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, Hammurabi, 1728 to 1686 BC, Hammurabi, are cast like the laws of still earlier codes in that part of the world, but the categorical type of statute law, with its distinctive religious note, is, as law, distinctively Israelite, though it has, strikingly enough, affinities with the form in which international treaties were cast in those days, especially treaties between a superior power and vassal states. The undisciplined body of slaves which left Egypt under the guidance of Moses had to spend a generation in the wilderness before a nation could be fashioned to invade the land of Canaan as conquerors and settlers. Some who did attempt to raid the Negev within a year from their leaving Egypt met with a costly repulse and were not disposed to repeat the experiment. A considerable part of the time that elapsed between the solemn events of Sinai Horeb and the large-scale entry into Canaan was spent in the oasis of Kadesh, to the south of the Negev. Another name given to this place is En Mishpat, the spring of judgment, which may enshrine a tradition that here judgment was pronounced as the Israelites submitted their case for the adjudication of Moses and his assessors. As for the name Kadesh, it simply means sanctuary. The fuller form, Kadesh Barnea, distinguishes it from other sanctuaries. This suggests that even before the settlement in Canaan, the Israelites consisted of a number of tribes united in part by a common ancestry, but much more so by common participation in the covenant with Yahweh. The outward and visible sign of their covenant unity was the sacred chest, the Ark of the Testimony, constructed by Moses, housed in a tent shrine. The tribes thus formed what in Greek history is known as an amphictonic league. Okay. An amphictonic league. Sometimes it's pronounced amphictyonic. Amphictyonic or amphictonic league. A group of states or tribes sharing a common ancestry, common sanctuary, which served as the focus of their federation. A tent shrine was conveniently movable and very suitable for a community that was so frequently on the march. Into the covenant bond, other groups might enter. In particular, we know of nomad communities in the Negev, such as the Kenites, to whom Moses' wife belongs, the Kenizzites, and the Jerahmeelites, who now or later allied themselves with the members of the tribe of Judah and ultimately appear to have been largely incorporated in that tribe. The Jerahmeelites. The Jerahmeelites. It's hard to pronounce these words sometimes when I need new glasses too, but so you got the Kenizzites and the Jerahmeelites, or the Jerahmeelites. Okay. Um, we don't have the CDs of how they pronounced it. Okay, they were actually on 8 tracks. Those got destroyed. Now, closely related to these nomadic groups was another called the Amalekites. I know I got that one right. And the bitter feud which Israel pursued against these from generation to generation can best be explained if they were guilty of some breach of covenant. Alliance with such nomad groups was a very different thing from alliance with a settled agricultural population of Canaan, with its seducing fertility rituals so menacing to the essential features of the pure Yahweh worship, which Israel learned in the wilderness. Even before they entered Canaan, the Israelites were strictly forbidden to make common cause with its inhabitants. There was some infiltration from the south into the central Negev, with which the tribe of Judah had an earlier connection. But that route, followed by the main body when they left Kadesh, led them south and east of the Dead Sea, where they skirted the territories of their kinsfolk of Edom, Moab, and Ammon, who had recently organized themselves as settled kingdoms. While they made no attack on these kindred groups, the Israelites acted quite differently toward 2 other kingdoms which lay further north in the Transjordan: the Amorite kingdom of Sihon in the Heshbon, and his northern neighbor Og in Bashan. They entered the realms of Sihon and Og as hostile invaders, overwhelmed their forces, and occupied their territory, the territory which became the tribal heritage of Reuben, Gad, and eastern Manasseh. Part, at least, of the Israelite community had thus adopted a settled agricultural way of life before crossing the Jordan. And when Moses is represented as giving them there in Transjordan in codified form the judgments and statutes which they were to observe in their new habitat, those which imply an agricultural way of life need not be regarded as anachronistic. Did you catch that? That's a little apologetic nugget right there. Right there. And it filtered down from F. Bruce at the University of Manchester to his student and my professor, Bruce Demarest, in his concern for apologetics in integrative theology, historical, biblical, systematic, apologetic, and practical. And it has now filtered down to me on the Republican professor. Now, you see here in this literature and this topic, there is no radical distinction between politics and theology. They are two sides of the same coin. Okay, so there is no radical distinction that we make arbitrarily here on the Republican Professor podcast. That's just not how we roll. That is a contemporary modern invention which all it does is make people more ignorant than they otherwise would be, because everybody has a theology and everybody implies a theology in their politics. When it's not articulated and there's no self-awareness, it usually causes damage. So I like to articulate it, get it out there. Let's talk about it. Let's learn about it, because it does require an attention span, as you can probably tell. So let me reread that. He's just talking about the settlement that happened before they crossed Canaan. They probably did start some agriculture. And so he said, part at least of the Israelite community had thus adopted a settled agricultural way of life before crossing the Jordan. And when Moses is represented as giving them there in Transjordan, in codified form, the judgments and statutes which they were to observe in their new habitat, those which imply an agricultural way of life need not be regarded as anachronistic. In other words, when you see agricultural references in the five books of Moses, right? Do you know what those are? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He says that those were not put there later and put there by people later. In other words, undermining the authority of the five books of Moses, because they were just kind of pasted together randomly by stuff later. He's saying, no, that doesn't follow. You can regard them as good sources for Israel's beginning. There in Transjordan, and that's not me saying this, this is the Rylands professor of biblical criticism and exegesis at the University of Manchester, a doctoral graduate of Aberdeen, a medieval university, one of the best in the world. Is there a better one? I don't think so. Maybe there is. I don't know. But anyway, let's continue. Okay, let's continue. In other words, he's not just making this up. I mean, he's not some rando dude that works at a bank and then teaches Sunday school. And he's writing, this is his Sunday school notes for stuff that his hobby. This is what he did his entire life, was study this stuff at the best places you could possibly study it with the best people. Okay. This is not random. There in Transjordan, Moses died. After he had commissioned his aide de camp, the Ephraimite Joshua, to be his successor and lead the people into Canaan proper. Joshua led them over Jordan in circumstances which impressed themselves on the national memory alongside the circumstances of their departure from Egypt. If, when Israel went out of Egypt, the sea looked and fled, as a later poet wrote, when they came into Canaan, Jordan turned back. Page 18 at the top. The Old Testament record attributes the drying up of the river to a landslide at Adam, modern Ed Dimaya, some 15 miles north of the place where Jordan runs into the Dead Sea. And sometimes it's placed Ed Damaya, and I'm sorry. If it's Ed Damaya or Ed Damaya, tomato, harassment, um, people, people. But the fact of its occurrence just at this time was evidence to them. And catch that. Did you catch that? Evidence. Evidence. Evidence, evidence, evidence. Faith and evidence are not opposites. Was evidence. That's an epistemology word, people. Was evidence to them that the God of their fathers, who had brought them safely out of Egypt, was now bringing them safely into Canaan. The collapse of the walls around the citadel of Jericho, which lay 2 miles west of the place where they crossed the river, was no doubt caused by the same seismic action as had brought about the landslide at Edamia. To the Israelites, it brought further confirmation of the directing power of Yahweh. Jericho, by the collapse of its walls, lay defenseless before them. As the first fruits of their conquests in Canaan, it was solemnly devoted to Yahweh with all that was in it. The imperishable wealth in the citadel was set aside to the service of Yahweh's sanctuary. The rest was consumed in a gigantic holocaust. That's the word that F.F. Bruce uses. It's not the word I would have used, but I'm not the one writing it. Now we are going to take a look at the footnote there because of the word Holocaust. The destruction of late Bronze Age Jericho is very difficult to date archaeologically, owing to the considerable erosion of the site during the 400 years that elapsed before the building of Iron Age Jericho. He cites 1 Kings 16:34. Okay, well, I think what he means is fire. I think that's what he means. The devotion of Jericho, together with the solemn ritual that preceded the assault, as described in the book of Joshua, indicates that the Israelites were engaged in a holy war. The engagements in which they took part, both east and west of Jordan, were known as the Wars of Yahweh and celebrated as such in sacred song. From Jericho they pressed into the heart of the country, taking one citadel after another, for the news of the fall of Jericho had struck terror into the hearts of many Canaanite garrisons. At one time they could have called upon Egypt for help, but Egypt was entering on a period of decline and was unable to make effective the control she had formerly claimed over central Canaan. Only along the western coastal strip, as far north as the Pass of Megiddo, did Egypt still exercise some measure of control. And even there, the Philistine settlement on the Mediterranean seaboard was soon to form a barrier against the extension of Egyptian power. A coalition of 5 military governors of Canaanite citadels attempted to bar the Israelites from turning south from Gibeon and the other cities of the Hivite Tetropolis in the central hill country, which had submitted to them as subject allies, but it was completely defeated, and the road to the south lay open to the invaders. They were unable to operate in the plains and valleys, where the chariot forces of the Canaanite citadels were too formidable for them to face, but before long they dominated and occupied the hill country of the center and south, and also the Galilean uplands north of the plain of Jezreel. The decisive stroke in the conquest of the north was the storming of the great city of Hazor, formerly the head of all of those kingdoms. Hazor, it sometimes is called Hazor. It's hard to know how to pronounce these things. Hazor is but one of several sites laid bare by archaeological excavation in recent years of citadels which fell shortly before 1200 BC to be rebuilt some decades later with thinner walls and a lower standard of material culture. We're on page 19 at the top. The tribes who settled in the north were divided from their fellows in central Canaan by a Canaanite chain of fortified positions strung along the plain of Jezreel from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan. The central tribes, in their turn, were cut off even more effectively and effectually from the contact with Judah farther south by the stronghold of Jerusalem, which remained a Canaanite enclave for a further 2 centuries. On one notable occasion, the northern and central blocks joined forces in an uprising against the military governors of the plain of Jezreel, who were steadily reducing them to serfdom, and their united rising was crowned with success in the Battle of Kishon. That was 1125 BC, when a sudden downpour flooded the torrent bed and put the horses and chariots of the Canaanites out of action. The light-armed Israelites swept down upon them and routed them. The impetus to united action on this occasion came not from the Israelite commander Barak, but from the prophetess Deborah, to whom at her headquarters in the hill country of Ephraim the tribesmen went up to have judgment pronounced in their disputes. It was at her instance that the message was sped throughout the tribes, calling them together for this holy war to the aid of Yahweh against the mighty, as we are told in the ancient triumph song in celebration of the victory preserved in Judges 5. The tribes that failed to respond are reproached, but nothing is said of a summons going to Judah. Judah was too completely cut off from the tribesmen of the center and the north. We got a little bit left to go here. We're going to make a fair use, do a transformative reading of this material. We'd like to thank Erdmans for making it available. We'd like to thank F. Bruce, my spiritual and intellectual grandfather, for writing it. When the tribes of Israel remembered their covenant bond, on an occasion like this, their united strength enabled them to repel their foes. But such united action, even on a smaller scale, was rare. When the danger which caused them to call upon the God of the covenant receded, the tendency was strong to slip back into conformity with the way of life of their Canaanite neighbors, to intermarry with them, to imitate their fertility rites in order to secure regular rainfall and good crops, and to think of Yahweh rather as a Baal or fertility god. than as the God who had delivered them from Egypt and made his nature and will known to them in the wilderness. The bond which united them to their fellow Israelites was thus weakened, and they became an easy prey to their enemies. It was not only Canaanite cities in the land itself that tried to reduce them to serfdom. From time to time, they suffered from incursions from beyond Jordan by their own kinsmen of Moab and Ammon and Edom, and more disastrously by Bedouin from remoter parts of Arabia, who, mounted on camels, raided their territory year by year at harvest time and destroyed their crops. These Midianites, or Ishmaelites, as they are called in the biblical record, would have made life impossible for the Israelites had they not been rallied by a leader from the tribe of Manasseh, Gideon by name, who led a small and mobile band against the invaders, took them by surprise, pursued them across the Jordan, and wrought great havoc in their ranks. In other words, special forces. Green, Green Berets. I'm kidding, but also not kidding. God ordained Green Berets. The grateful tribesmen invited Gideon to become their king and found a hereditary monarchy, but he refused. Such a monarchy, on the pattern of the monarchies which governed Israel's neighbors, was too much out of keeping, in his judgment, with the ideals which they had learned in the wilderness. That is a really profound thing that he just said. Let Yahweh alone be acknowledged as king in Israel. Let him use as his agents not one particular family, but the man whom from time to time he might choose and endow with special powers to rule his people and defend their cause. From the number of such charismatic persons who arose in Israel in this period and led them back to loyalty to Yahweh and forward to victory against their enemies, the whole period is known as the period of the judges. We got one more paragraph left. One of Gideon's sons, Abimelech by name, did not share his father's scruples about kingship. He, however, was the son of a Canaanite woman and had been brought up with his mother's relatives at Shechem. After his father's death, he attempted to succeed to his power, exterminating most of the other members of Gideon's family in the process. For 3 years he reigned as king from Shechem, but his kingdom did not extend beyond western Manasseh. His subjects soon grew tired of him, and he met his death in trying to put down their revolt. Chapter 2 is called The Philistines and the Hebrew Monarchy, and that is where we get into the story of Saul. Well, prior to that, co co coextensively with that would be Samuel, Saul, and David, who was the father of Solomon. So this is a very important development. Thanks for joining me on The Republican Professor on this 4 December 2025 years after Jesus, looking at the history of Israel. Chapter 1, Israel's beginnings, 1300 to 1100 BC. and the introductory chapter in F. Bruce's Israel and the Nations, From the Exodus to the Fall of the Second Temple. The subtitle is From the Exodus to the Fall of the Second Temple. F. Bruce got his doctorate from the University of Aberdeen, one of the four medieval universities in what became Great Britain. Aberdeen is in Scotland. St Andrews is in Scotland. The two medieval universities in England were Oxford and Cambridge. Cambridge in what was Anglo-Saxon territory of East Anglia, and Oxfordshire is, of course, a Mercian township. And so if you know that background, great. If you don't, I want to point out that the Church of England, the church in England, maybe is a better way to say it, uh, sought to encourage education related to these matters with high academic excellence. And I say they sought, they didn't always achieve it, but they sought it probably better than all other countries. Maybe the exception of Germany, but um, I'm not going to make any judgment about that. People would say Rome because of the Catholic universities there, but maybe somebody would defend Salamanca in Spain, or the universities in France. But I'm most familiar with the heritage that I have, which is the British universities, because my professors studied at these medieval universities. My professors studied at Cambridge, Oxford, Aberdeen. These taught at Manchester. You know, and in the case of F. Bruce, taught my professor Bruce Demarest, who got his PhD at the University of Manchester. So um, I'm grateful that you joined me for this, and I hope that you are getting some value out of it. I want you to understand that this takes some time to sink in, and when you're studying this, give yourself a lot of patience. Take your time. Just don't rush it. You can't rush this stuff. But probably when I was going through this, there were certain bells and whistles going off in your mind with contemporary application. That's very good. That's very good. And as you'll see next time, I mean, the Philistines are in the coastland, what is now called Gaza. That's where the Philistines are. And there's this conflict that occurs there and this political development. I want to reread one sentence from the introduction, and then we'll stop there. Okay. The sentence was, while these books have come down to us as Holy Scripture, they are historical source documents of first-rate worth. The chapters which follow are not concerned with them as canonical writings. F. Bruce says in his introductory chapter, page 11 at the bottom, 12 at the top, but as material for constructing a political narrative. This book is about politics, and it's very important that you pay close attention to what it says. Thanks for joining me on The Republican Professor. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. It is Thursday, 4 December, 2025 years after Jesus